Earth drew a line in space. Every empire feared what happened when they crossed it. The galaxy was old, and humans were new. That was the first thing every alien child learned about the species called humans. They came late to the stars, long after the great empires had already carved up the galaxy into territories, trade lanes, and spheres of fear. When humans finally walked out of their solar system, the galaxy barely noticed. There were thousands of species out there, some old as stars, some young as morning light, and one more species joining the crowd did not seem like anything special. At first, the galactic community treated humans the way anyone treats a new neighbor who just moved into a small house on a big street. Polite, distant, mildly curious, and completely unbothered. The old empires had rules for new species. They called it the ladder of standing. A species had to prove itself before it was allowed to speak in the big meetings, trade in the big markets, or vote in the big councils. Humans were placed at the very bottom rung of that ladder, next to species that had just discovered fire. Nobody objected. Humans did not complain either. They simply watched, listened, and built. For the first 20 years after humanity's first contact with the wider galaxy, the story of Earth was a quiet one. Ambassadors from Earth sat in the back rows of galactic meetings. Human traders were given the worst deals and smallest quotas. Human ships were searched twice as often as other ships at galactic checkpoints, just because someone somewhere decided humans looked untrustworthy. There was no war. There was no big incident. There was only a long, patient silence from a species everyone assumed they understood. They did not understand humans at all. While the galaxy looked away, humanity did what it always did best. It adapted. It studied. It learned the technology of 100 different species, took what worked, threw away what did not, and built something new from the pieces. Human engineers spent their nights taking apart old alien ships bought second-hand at scrapyards, learning every wire and every rule of physics those ships obeyed. Human scientists spent decades reading alien textbooks meant for children, because those textbooks contained secrets that alien empires guarded like treasure. Humanity also studied something else. It studied war. Every species in the galaxy had fought wars, some small, some so large they had erased entire star systems from the map. Humans read those histories the way a young boxer studies old fights, searching for patterns, searching for mistakes, searching for the moment when a strong side became weak and a weak side became strong. Nobody in the galaxy paid attention to a species that was, by every measure they used, harmless. That was the first mistake. 23 years after first contact, a diplomat from Earth stood in the Grand Assembly of the Concord, the loose organization of empires that ran most galactic affairs. Her name was Ambassador Elena Voss, and she was not there to ask for more trade routes or better treatment. She stood in front of thousands of delegates from hundreds of species, and she made an announcement that nobody expected. Humanity is drawing a border, she said. We call it the line. It sits at the edge of our solar system, along the orbit of what we call the Kuiper Belt, extending outward in every direction. No armed vessel from outside will be allowed to cross that line without permission. This is not a request. This is a notice. The assembly laughed. Not all of it, but enough of it. Somewhere in the back rows, a delegate from the Thren Combine, a species of tall insectoid warriors who had once conquered 40 star systems in a single century, actually laughed out loud, a strange clicking sound that echoed through the chamber. A border, the Thren delegate said, when the laughter died down, drawn by children with sticks. What will you do if we cross it? Ask us politely to leave. Ambassador Voss did not smile. She did not raise her voice either. She simply looked at the Thren delegate, and at all the delegates around him, and said something that would be repeated for generations afterward, translated into 1,000 languages, quoted in 1,000 history books. You will not like the answer to that question. We hope you never have to learn it. Then she sat down, and the assembly moved on to other business, because most of the galaxy still believed humans were a small, harmless species making a small, harmless joke. For the next several years, nothing happened. No empire tested the line, mostly because no empire cared enough to try. Humanity was not seen as a threat, and a border drawn by a weak species was seen as a border that meant nothing. The galaxy had bigger concerns. The Thren Combine was locked in a slow Cold War with the Vantic Assembly, a coalition of merchant states that controlled most of the trade lanes in the eastern spiral arm. The Skarn Dominion, an old and proud empire ruled by a single immortal emperor, was busy putting down rebellions in its outer colonies. Nobody had time to worry about a border around a small yellow star nobody wanted anyway. But Earth kept building. Behind that line, in the dark quiet of its own solar system, humanity was not idle. Shipyards grew in orbit around Mars and Jupiter's moons. New kinds of engines were tested in the empty space beyond Neptune, engines that broke rules of physics the rest of the galaxy considered fixed and final. New kinds of weapons were built and tested on asteroids, weapons designed not just to destroy ships, but to destroy the will to fight. Most importantly, humanity built something the rest of the galaxy did not have. It built unity. Every alien empire out there was a patchwork of feuding houses, rival factions, and old grudges. Earth had wars in its own history too, terrible ones, but by the time the galaxy arrived at humanity's door, Earth had already learned the hardest lesson any species can learn. Divided, they were prey. United, they could become something else entirely. By the 40th year after first contact, Earth's economy had grown by numbers nobody bothered to check, because nobody bothered to look. Earth's population, once seen as a weakness because humans lived and died so quickly compared to some ancient alien species, became a strength. Humans had more workers, more soldiers, more thinkers, more everything, simply because they made more of themselves faster than anyone expected. Still, the line held quiet. A few merchant ships, unaware of the new rules, drifted close to the boundary, and were gently turned away by patrol ships that appeared out of nowhere, spoke politely, and escorted the confused traders back the way they came. No shots were fired. No threats were made beyond the first warning. The patrols simply said the same thing every time. "This is Earth space. Please turn back. We do not wish for conflict." Word spread slowly through the trade lanes. Humans were odd, some said. Overly cautious, said others. A species so weak they had to bluff about a border just to feel safe, said the ones who mattered most. The young officers and ambitious commanders sitting in the war rooms of the great empires. Men and women who had never once seen a human ship fight, and who assumed that meant human ships could not fight at all. That assumption would prove to be the single most expensive mistake in the history of the galaxy. 61 years after first contact, the balance of power in the galaxy had shifted, though few outside of Earth understood how much. The old empires were still fighting their old wars, still trading their old grudges, still measuring strength by the number of ships in a fleet and the size of an empire's territory. Nobody thought to measure the strength of unity, or the strength of patience, or the strength of a species that had spent 6 decades quietly becoming something far more dangerous than anyone realized. It was around this time that a new player entered the story. The Koresh Directorate, a rising empire from the Outer Rim, had spent the last 30 years conquering smaller species one after another, absorbing their worlds, their resources, and their populations into a growing machine of war. The Koresh were not old like the Thren or proud like the Skarn. They were hungry. Their leader, a general known only as Vosk Drenar, had built his entire reputation on a simple philosophy. Any species that could not defend itself deserved to be conquered. Vosk Drenar had heard the stories about the human line. Everyone in the galaxy had, by now, though most treated it as a strange old rumor, the kind of story spacers tell each other in bars near the edge of known space. A weak species with a big mouth, claiming ownership of a border nobody respected, protected by threats nobody had ever seen carried out. Drenar did not believe in rumors. He believed in results, and the fact that nobody had actually tested the human line in 6 decades told him one simple thing. Either humans were bluffing, in which case conquering their system would be easy and profitable, or humans were telling the truth, in which case whatever they were hiding behind that line was worth stealing for the Koresh Directorate's own war machine. Either way, in his mind, there was no reason not to look. He began drawing up plans, slowly, carefully, the way a predator studies a herd before choosing which animal to chase. He sent scout ships to the edges of known space, gathering whatever scraps of information existed about Earth and its solar system. He studied old trade records, old diplomatic transcripts, even old jokes told by merchants who had once been turned away at the line. What he found troubled him a little, though not enough to change his plans. Human ships, the few that had been spotted outside their system on diplomatic missions, moved strangely, faster than expected for a species supposedly so far behind in technology. Human engineers who worked on foreign shipyards, hired because their labor was cheap, had a habit of asking very specific, very technical questions about weapon systems, questions that seemed almost too precise for simple curiosity. Drenner's advisors urged caution. One of his oldest generals, a scarred veteran named Iset Kor, argued strongly against testing the line at all. "We know almost nothing about what is behind it," Kor said, standing in the war room of Drenar's flagship, staring at a star map with a small red boundary marked far in the distance. A boundary human diplomats called the line, and everyone else simply called a rumor. In 60 years, no empire has crossed it and returned to tell us what happened. Not because nothing happened, because nothing came back. Drenar was not moved by this argument. In his mind, the absence of information was not proof of danger. It was proof of secrecy, and secrecy usually meant something valuable was being hidden. An empire that hid its strength instead of showing it off was, to Drenar's way of thinking, an empire that was afraid, and fear was the surest sign of weakness. "We will not attack with our whole fleet," Drennar finally decided, silencing the debate in the war room with a single raised hand. "We will send a probing force, enough ships to test their defenses, not enough to provoke a war we are not ready to fight. If they turn us away politely, as they have turned away every merchant and scout before us, we will learn that their threats are empty, and we will plan a full invasion at our leisure. If they fight back, we will learn what weapons they have, and we will retreat before losses grow too large. Either way, Koresh Directorate wins." It seemed, on paper, like a careful, reasonable plan. A measured first step by a cautious commander who did not want to risk everything on an unknown threat. What Vosk Drenner did not know, what nobody outside of Earth's solar system truly knew, was that the line was not simply a border on a star map. It was the edge of something humanity had spent 60 years building in complete secrecy, something so far beyond what the rest of the galaxy expected that even the most careful probing force would not survive long enough to send home a useful report. Behind the line, deep within the asteroid belt and scattered across 100 hidden shipyards on the moons of the outer planets, the human fleet waited. It was not a fleet built for the kind of galaxy the old empires knew, a galaxy of slow wars fought over decades, careful trades of territory, and formal declarations before formal battles. It was a fleet built by a species that had studied every mistake every empire before them had ever made, and had decided, quietly and without announcement, never to repeat a single one of them. Admiral Marcus Chen commanded that fleet. He was 53 years old, born on a colony station orbiting Jupiter, and he had spent his entire adult life training for a war he hoped would never come. He did not want glory. He did not want conquest. He wanted, more than anything, for the galaxy to leave Earth alone, and he understood, the way every good soldier eventually understands, that peace sometimes required the clear and terrible ability to end a war before it truly began. On a quiet morning, measured by Earth's clocks, though there was no true morning in the endless dark of space, Chen received a report from the automated sensor network that stretched across the entire line, a network of hidden satellites and drones that watched every corner of the boundary humanity had drawn 61 years before. Unknown ships, Koresh Directorate markings, 6 vessels, moving in careful formation, heading directly toward Earth space. Chen read the report twice, then set it down on his desk, and allowed himself a small, tired breath. 61 years of quiet. 61 years of patrols turning away confused merchants, of diplomats repeating the same careful warning at every galactic meeting, of a whole species holding its breath and hoping the rest of the galaxy would simply leave them be. That quiet was about to end. He pressed a button on his console, and across 100 hidden shipyards, across 1,000 waiting ships, across the entire defensive network humanity had built in the shadow of a galaxy that never once bothered to look closely, a single alert went out. The line had been crossed. It was time to show the galaxy exactly why humanity had drawn it in the first place. to understand why Admiral Chen reacted so calmly, and why the network he commanded could respond in mere seconds instead of minutes. One had to understand the 61 years that came before this single ordinary morning. Earth had not simply built ships and hoped for the best. Earth had built a culture around the line, a shared understanding passed down through schools, through military training, through the simple stories parents told their children about why the sky above them stayed quiet and safe. Every child born on Earth or on one of its many colonies grew up knowing the story of Ambassador Voss, standing before the Grand Assembly, calm and unafraid, telling an entire galaxy of empires that humanity would defend its home. It was taught in classrooms not as a boast, but as a promise, one that every generation was reminded came with responsibility. The line was not free. It required constant work, constant vigilance, constant sacrifice, from ordinary people who spent their lives building ships, training as pilots, designing better sensors, or simply paying the taxes that funded a defense network few of them would ever see with their own eyes. Marcus Chen himself had grown up on that story. His grandfather had been one of the original engineers who helped design the first generation of hidden shipyards in the years right after Ambassador Voss made her famous declaration. His grandfather used to tell him, when he was young and restless and dreaming of becoming a starship pilot instead of an engineer like the rest of his family, that the most important battles were the ones nobody ever saw, the ones won through decades of quiet preparation, rather than a single dramatic moment of glory. Anyone can fight when the enemy is already at the door, his grandfather used to say, sitting on the porch of their small home on the Martian surface, looking up at the pale twinkle of distant stars. It takes real courage to spend your whole life preparing for a war you hope never comes, when nobody around you understands why the work matters, and nobody will thank you for it even if you succeed. Those words had stayed with Chen his entire life, through flight school, through his slow rise from junior pilot to fleet commander, through every long night spent reviewing simulations and contingency plans that most of his colleagues assumed would never actually be needed. He had believed, the way his grandfather believed, that the work mattered even without recognition, that the quiet decades of preparation were themselves a kind of victory, whether or not the galaxy ever noticed. Now, watching the first real test of that preparation unfold on his tactical display, he understood exactly how much depended on choices made decades before he ever took command. The sensor network that had detected the Koresh ships within seconds of their crossing had been designed by engineers who retired before Chen was even born. The response protocols his staff now followed without hesitation had been refined through 100 training exercises, adjusted and perfected by officers who had spent entire careers preparing for a battle they themselves would never fight. This was the true strength of the line, hidden beneath the ships and weapons and clever technology the rest of the galaxy would eventually learn to fear. It was not simply a defense network. It was the accumulated will of an entire species, poured patiently into a single unbroken purpose across 3 full generations, waiting quietly for the moment someone finally decided to test it. Elsewhere across the solar system, in the colony stations and shipyards and quiet farming settlements scattered from Mercury to the icy moons of Neptune, ordinary people went about their ordinary lives without any idea that history was about to be written a few 100 million kilometers away. Teachers taught classes, engineers repaired equipment, children played games in the recreational domes of Martian cities, unaware that 6 unfamiliar ships had just crossed into their solar system, carrying a question the galaxy had wondered about for 61 years. That question was about to be answered, not with words, but with the careful, disciplined action of a fleet that had waited its entire existence for this single moment of purpose. The story of how humanity came to draw the line in the first place stretched back further than most people in the galaxy realized, further even than Ambassador Voss's famous speech before the Grand Assembly. It began, in truth, in the very first years after first contact, when a small delegation of human scientists and diplomats traveled beyond their own solar system for the first time, and saw, with their own eyes, exactly how the galaxy treated species it considered weak. They visited trading stations where weaker species were charged triple the fair price for basic goods, simply because they had no power to negotiate otherwise. They witnessed diplomatic meetings where smaller empires were talked over, ignored, or dismissed outright by the older, more established powers. They heard stories, quiet and often unspoken, about entire civilizations that had been absorbed, conquered, or simply erased by empires stronger than themselves, their histories reduced to footnotes in the records of whichever power had claimed their territory. One member of that early delegation, a young historian named Dr. Amina Farouk, wrote extensively about what she witnessed during those first difficult years of contact, and her writings would later become required reading for every officer who served under the defense doctrine that eventually grew into the line. She observed that the galaxy operated not on rules of fairness or cooperation, but on a simple, brutal calculation of strength. Species that could defend themselves were treated with caution and respect. Species that could not were treated as resources to be used, ignored, or discarded as convenient. "We have a choice," she wrote, in a report that eventually reached the highest levels of Earth's fractured, still unifying governments. "We can spend the coming decades hoping the galaxy's stronger powers choose to treat us fairly, out of kindness alone, a hope that history, both our own and theirs, gives us little reason to believe in. Or we can spend those same decades building the strength to guarantee our own safety, regardless of whether the galaxy ever chooses kindness at all." It was this report, more than any single event or decision, that convinced Earth's fractured nations to finally set aside centuries of rivalry and division. The threat from beyond their own sky proved to be the one thing capable of accomplishing what generations of diplomats and idealists on Earth itself had never managed to achieve. A galaxy full of empires that measured worth purely by strength gave humanity a single, unifying reason to become strong together, rather than remain divided and vulnerable apart. The early years of unification were not smooth. Old nations argued over how resources should be shared, which languages should be used in joint military training, whose traditions and holidays should be observed in the new unified calendar that eventually replaced dozens of separate national systems. There were protests, disagreements, even moments when the entire unification project seemed at risk of collapsing back into the old divisions that had defined human history for so long. But slowly, decade by decade, the vision Dr. Farouk had first articulated took hold. Shipyards that had once belonged to separate national militaries were combined into unified defense projects. Scientists who had once competed for national prestige began sharing research freely, understanding that a stronger, safer Earth benefited everyone, regardless of which country their ancestors had come from. Military academies began training officers from every corner of the old world side by side, teaching a new generation that their loyalty belonged not to any single nation, but to the shared project of humanity's survival among the stars. By the time Ambassador Voss stood before the Grand Assembly and announced the line, that unification had already been decades in the making, quiet and largely unnoticed by a galaxy too busy with its own internal rivalries to pay much attention to a small, unimportant species finally getting its own affairs in order. The line itself was, in many ways, simply the visible symbol of a much larger, much quieter transformation that had already reshaped humanity from a divided, vulnerable species into something the galaxy would eventually come to respect and to fear in equal measure. The Admiral Chen understood this history intimately, having studied it throughout his own education and training, and he thought about it now, watching the 6 Koresh ships drift deeper into human space on his tactical display. Every ship in his fleet, every sensor in the vast network stretching across the solar system, every drill and simulation his crews had practiced for years, existed because of choices made decades before, by people who had understood, long before the rest of the galaxy ever noticed, that survival required more than hope. It required patient, deliberate work, sustained across generations, carried out by a species finally united enough in purpose to see that work through to its conclusion. The 6 ships continued their approach, unaware of the history that had shaped the response now converging upon them. In a few short hours, the galaxy's long era of underestimating humanity would begin its slow, inevitable unraveling, though neither Captain Solon nor his crew yet understood the scale of what they had stumbled into. All they knew, for now, was that the empty space around their small formation had grown suddenly, inexplicably crowded with unfamiliar ships that had appeared with no warning at all. Earth drew a line in space. Every empire feared what happened when they crossed it. The 6 ships of the Koresh Directorate probing force moved through the dark at a careful, measured pace, exactly as General Vosk Drenar had ordered. Their commander, a young officer named Captain Reth Solan, had been chosen for this mission because of his reputation for caution. Drenar wanted a probe, not a battle, and Solan was known throughout the Directorate fleet as a man who never took a risk he could avoid. Solan stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Ashen Talon, watching the sensor displays with careful attention. Behind him, 5 smaller escort ships kept formation, their engines humming quietly in the vacuum. Ahead of them, according to every map his navigators could produce, lay the boundary humans called the Line, and beyond that, a solar system with a single small star, 9 planets, and a species everyone in the galaxy assumed was too weak to matter. "Report," Solan said, without turning from the display. "No contacts," his sensor officer replied. "No ships, no stations, no defensive platforms, just empty space. Same as the report said. If humans have a defense out here, sir, it isn't showing itself." Solan nodded slowly. This matched everything he had read in the briefing packets before the mission began. 61 years of human warnings, and not a single confirmed sighting of an actual human warship outside their own trade lanes. It was beginning to look, more and more, like General Drenar's theory was correct. The Line was a bluff, an old and clever piece of theater, performed by a weak species trying to buy itself safety through fear alone. "Continue forward," Solan ordered. "Slow and steady. If we see anything at all, I want to know immediately." The Ashen Talon and its 5 escorts crossed the invisible boundary of the Line at exactly 1400 hours, Directorate Standard Time. Nothing happened. No alarms, no flashes of light, no sudden appearance of enemy ships. Just the same quiet dark that had surrounded them for the entire journey. Solan allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "Continue toward the 4th planet," he said, naming the world humans called Mars, the location of one of Earth's oldest and largest colonies. "Let's see what these humans are really hiding." What Captain Solan did not know, what none of his crew could have possibly known, was that the moment his ships crossed the Line, a message had already traveled through a network of sensors far more advanced than anything the Koresh Directorate had ever built. That message had reached Admiral Marcus Chen within seconds, not minutes. And in the 61 years since Earth first drew its border, humanity had prepared for this exact moment more times than anyone outside their solar system could imagine. Through simulations, through drills, through careful planning that treated the safety of Earth as the single most important problem any human mind could solve. Admiral Chen did not rush. He did not panic. He gathered his staff calmly in the command center, buried deep within a hollowed-out asteroid 300 million kilometers from where the Koresh ships now drifted, and he reviewed the sensor data with the same careful attention a doctor might give to a patient's test results. 6 ships, said Commander Sarah Osei, Chen's second-in-command, pointing to the holographic display floating above the command table. Configuration matches known Koresh Directorate warship designs. 1 flagship, 5 escorts. Weapons are powered, but not charged for firing. They're not here to attack, sir. They're here to look. "A probe," Chen said quietly. "Someone out there finally got curious enough to check if we meant what we said." "Orders, Admiral?" Chen was quiet for a long moment, studying the slow, careful path of the 6 Koresh ships as they moved deeper into the solar system, heading toward Mars. He thought about the 61 years of patience, the 61 years of turning away confused merchants with polite words instead of weapons fire, the 61 years of hoping the galaxy would simply respect a line drawn on a map without ever needing to learn what stood behind it. He thought about his daughter, born on a colony station near Saturn, who had never known a galaxy where humans lived, in fear of the sky above them. "We show them," Chen finally said. "Not everything, not yet, but enough that they understand, clearly and completely, that this line was never a bluff." He gave a series of orders, calm and precise, the kind of orders that came from decades of preparation rather than sudden fear. Across the solar system, hidden fleets began to move. Not the entire might of Earth's defense force, not yet, but enough ships to send an unmistakable message to any commander smart enough to understand it. Captain Solan's sensors picked up the first contact 40 minutes later, and what he saw made his blood run cold. They had appeared out of nowhere. No warning, no gradual approach, no slow build-up that his sensors could have detected in advance. One moment the space around his small formation was empty. The next moment, arranged in a wide, patient circle around his 6 ships, were 40 human vessels, larger and stranger in design than anything his intelligence briefings had prepared him for. "Report," Solan said, his voice tighter now, the careful confidence of a few minutes before, replaced by something closer to alarm. 40 contacts, sir. Configuration unknown. Our sensors can't get a clear read on their weapon systems or shield strength. They're just there, surrounding us." Solan stared at the display, his mind racing through every scenario his training had prepared him for, and finding that none of them quite matched what was happening now. 6 decades of galactic rumors about human ships that moved faster than anyone expected. Human engineers who asked too many precise questions. Human diplomats who spoke with quiet confidence, instead of the nervous energy of a weak species making empty threats. All of it suddenly felt less like rumor and more like warning. A single channel opened on his communications display, unrequested, the human ships simply choosing to speak without waiting for permission. "Koresh Directorate Vessels," said a calm, steady voice, translated instantly into Solan's own language by his ship's systems. "You have crossed into Earth space without permission. This is your first and only warning. Power down your weapons systems and prepare to be escorted back across the boundary. We do not wish for conflict." Solan's tactical officer looked at him, waiting for orders, and for a long moment Solan said nothing at all, weighing the same choice every commander before him in the history of the galaxy had faced when confronted with an unknown force. Retreat, and risk his career, his reputation, and General Drenner's trust, returning home with nothing to show for the mission but a story of 40 mysterious ships that might have been nothing more than an elaborate bluff, or hold his position, gather what information he could, and prove once and for all whether humanity's line was real strength or empty theater. He chose, in the end, to gather information. It was, in hindsight, the second worst decision of his career. "Hold position," Solan ordered. "Charge weapons to combat readiness. If they want to test us, let's see what they're actually capable of." The human channel remained open, and the same calm voice spoke again, without any change in tone, without the slightest hint of anger or fear. "You have chosen not to comply. We understand. Please know that what happens next is a direct result of that choice, not our preference." Then the channel closed, and everything changed. Solan's sensor officer began shouting warnings, a fraction of a second before the first of the human ships opened fire, and in that same fraction of a second, Solan understood, with sudden and complete clarity, exactly how badly he had misjudged the situation. The weapons the human ships used were not the kind of weapons Directorate ships were built to withstand. They were not simple energy blasts or kinetic projectiles. They struck with a precision that seemed almost impossible, disabling engines, weapons, and shield generators on his escort ships within seconds, without destroying the ships themselves. "They're not trying to kill us," his tactical officer said, disbelief plain in his voice, watching as one Koresh escort after another went dark, drifting powerless in space, but very clearly still intact. "They're disarming us." It was, in its own strange way, more frightening than an outright attack would have been. An empire that fought to kill was predictable. An empire with the precision and restraint to disable 6 warships without destroying a single one, in a matter of seconds, was something else entirely. It meant they had the power to do far worse, and had simply chosen not to. Solan's flagship was the last to be hit. A single, focused strike tore through the Ashen Talon's weapon array, leaving the ship crippled but its crew unharmed. Solan stood on his darkened bridge, emergency lighting casting everything in dim red, and listened as the same calm human voice returned to his communications display. "Your weapons are disabled. Your ships remain intact. Your crews are alive. This is the mercy the Directorate would not have shown us, had our situations been reversed. Return to your empire, Captain Solan, and deliver this message exactly as we give it to you. Earth's line is not a suggestion. It is not a bluff. It is not a border drawn by a weak species hoping to be left alone through empty threats. It is a promise, And we have kept every part of that promise for 61 years without needing to prove it to anyone. You have forced our hand today. We hope your empire learns from this, so that we never need to prove it again, in a way that costs more than a few disabled engines." Solon sat in stunned silence, staring at the dark display where the human voice had spoken, absorbing the sheer scale of his miscalculation. His entire mission had been built on the assumption that human restraint was weakness, that 61 years without conflict meant 61 years of empty bluffing. Instead, he now understood, with the cold clarity of a man who had nearly led his crew to their deaths, that human restraint had been a choice, made by a species with the power to enforce their line completely, who had simply chosen mercy over violence for as long as mercy was possible. Word of the encounter reached General Vosk Drenar 6 hours later, delivered by a shaken Captain Solon aboard his crippled flagship, now slowly making its way back toward Directorate space under its own limited power. Drenar listened to the report in complete silence, his expression unreadable, as Solon described the 40 ships that appeared from nowhere, the precise and merciless disarming of his entire formation, and the calm, almost gentle warning delivered by an unseen human commander who had shown restraint, even while proving overwhelming strength. When Solon finished, Drenar was quiet for a long time, staring at the star map on his war room wall, at the small red boundary that marked the edge of human space, a boundary he had assumed was empty theater, and was now beginning to understand might be the single most dangerous border in the entire galaxy. His old general, Iset Kor, the one who had warned against this mission from the very beginning, stood quietly in the corner of the war room, saying nothing, though the look on his weathered face made his thoughts perfectly clear without a single word spoken. "They could have destroyed us," Drenar finally said, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. 6 ships, deep in their own territory, completely at their mercy. They could have destroyed us without a single witness surviving to tell the story, and no one in the galaxy would have ever known what happened to us. "But they didn't," Kor said quietly. "They let us go. They let us go, and they made sure we understood exactly why." Drenar turned to face his old general, and for the first time in many years, those in the room saw something in his expression that few of his officers had ever witnessed before. Not fear exactly, but something close to it, a dawning, uncomfortable respect for an enemy he had badly underestimated. "Why would they do that?" Drenar asked. "Why show mercy to an enemy that came to test their strength? Any other empire in this galaxy would have destroyed us to send a clearer message." Kor considered the question carefully before answering. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "because they understand something the rest of us do not. A dead enemy tells no stories. A living enemy, humbled and afraid, tells every other empire in the galaxy exactly what happens when you cross their line, without a single human life lost in the telling." Drenar sat down heavily in his chair, staring at the star map, at that small red boundary that had seemed so insignificant just one day before, and understood, with a growing sense of dread, that he had just made a mistake far larger than a single failed probing mission. He had confirmed for the entire galaxy to eventually learn that humanity's line was real, that their strength was real, and that their restraint, far from being a sign of weakness, was in fact the most terrifying part of the entire encounter. Because a species with that much power, choosing mercy instead of slaughter, was a species that had already decided exactly how much force was necessary, and not 1 ounce more. That kind of control did not come from a young, desperate species bluffing its way through the galaxy. It came from a species that had planned, prepared, and perfected its response to this exact scenario for decades, waiting patiently behind their line for the day someone finally tested it. Drenar had wanted to learn what Earth was hiding. Now he knew. What frightened him most was not the 40 ships that had surrounded his small formation, or the precise weapons that had disarmed his fleet in mere seconds. What frightened him most was the calm, steady voice that had delivered the warning, a voice that carried no anger, no fear, and no hesitation, the voice of a species that had been ready for this moment since long before Vosk Drenar had ever given the order to cross the line. Somewhere in his war room, a single thought settled into General Drenar's mind, one that would not leave him for the rest of that long, uneasy night. If 40 ships were enough to disarm his probing force without breaking a sweat, and if that had been a deliberate, careful, measured response, rather than the full extent of human strength, then the real question facing the Koresh Directorate was no longer whether Earth's line was real. The real question was how much more power lay hidden behind it, waiting quietly for the day a true invasion force decided to test the line for good. Aboard the disabled Ashen Talon, drifting slowly back toward Directorate space under limited backup power, Captain Reth Solon spent the long weeks of the return journey replaying the encounter again and again in his mind. He was not a coward, and he did not believe himself to be a poor commander, yet he could not shake the feeling that he had walked into something far larger than his mission briefing had prepared him for, something that no amount of caution could have fully anticipated. He spoke often during those quiet weeks with his ship's chief engineer, a steady older woman named Iris Vantal who had served with the Directorate fleet for nearly 30 years and had seen more battles than most officers twice her age. She had been on the bridge during the encounter, watching the human weapons strike with impossible precision, disabling systems without so much as scorching the hull plating around them. "In 30 years, I've never seen weapons fire that precise," she told Solon one evening, as the crippled ship drifted through the dark toward home. "Most weapons in this galaxy are built to destroy, overwhelming force, applied until the target stops functioning. What they used on us was different. It was surgical. They knew exactly what they wanted to hit, and they hit only that, nothing more." Solon turned the thought over carefully. "You're saying it wasn't luck?" "I'm saying it was the opposite of luck. Luck would have been messy. This was controlled, deliberate, and precise enough to suggest they've practiced that exact maneuver more times than we can imagine. You don't develop that kind of accuracy overnight, Captain. You develop it through decades of drills against targets built to test exactly that kind of restraint." It was a small detail, buried within a much larger and more frightening story, but it stayed with Solon long after his report had been filed and forgotten by most of the Directorate's senior officers who read it. Somewhere behind that boundary, humans had been training for exactly this moment for a very long time, refining not just their strength but their control over that strength, until they could reach across the vacuum of space and disable a warship without ever intending to kill the people inside it. Word of Solon's mission did not stay contained within Directorate military channels for long. As with most secrets in a galaxy full of merchants, traders, and gossiping spacers, the story eventually leaked, first to a handful of trusted allies within the Koresh government, then slowly outward to neighboring empires who had their own reasons to be curious about the mysterious human boundary. The Vantic Assembly, a coalition of merchant states that valued profit above almost everything else, took particular interest in the story, less out of fear and more out of simple curiosity about what kind of technology could produce such precise, controlled weapons fire. Vantic traders had done business with Earth before, cautious and limited business conducted at the very edges of human territory, and some among their leadership began to wonder, quietly, whether it might finally be worth approaching humanity as genuine equals, rather than a species to be tolerated at the bottom of the galactic ladder. The Skarn Dominion, ruled by its immortal emperor and proud of a history stretching back thousands of years, reacted with a mixture of skepticism and unease. Skarn philosophy held that true strength revealed itself openly, through conquest and clear displays of dominance, not through quiet restraint and careful secrecy. And yet even the most skeptical voices within the Skarn court found themselves troubled by the story of the calm human voice that had delivered its warning, without a trace of fear, sparing an enemy fleet not out of weakness, but out of what appeared to be genuine, calculated choice. For General Drennar himself, the story marked the beginning of a long, uncomfortable education about a species his empire had underestimated for over 6 decades. He kept Solon's full report close at hand in the months that followed, reading and rereading the details of the encounter, searching for weaknesses, searching for patterns, searching for anything that might explain how a species so recently arrived among the stars could have built something so far beyond what any established empire had managed to develop. He found no easy answers. What he found instead, slowly and reluctantly, was a growing respect for an enemy he had assumed would be simple to understand, and a dawning realization that the 61 years of silence behind Earth's line had not been 61 years of weakness at all. They had been 61 years of patient, disciplined preparation, carried out by a species that understood something Drennar was only now beginning to grasp himself. Real strength did not need to announce itself constantly to be real. Sometimes the most dangerous strength of all was the kind that waited quietly, confident enough in its own preparation that it never needed to prove anything until the moment finally, truly demanded it. On the human side of the encounter, Admiral Chen filed his own detailed report following Solon's retreat, a report that would shape defense planning for the following 2 years, in ways few outside the highest levels of command ever fully appreciated. He noted, with careful precision, exactly how the Koresh ships had responded to the initial warning, how long they had hesitated before deciding to hold position rather than withdraw, and how their weapons had been charged but not fired in the moments before the human fleet moved to disable them. "They came to test us, not to fight us," Chen wrote in his official assessment, submitted to Earth's Unified Defense Council in the weeks following the encounter. That distinction matters. A probing force testing our resolve is a very different threat than a force committed to genuine conflict. We showed enough strength to answer their question honestly, without revealing the full scope of what waits behind our line. If the Koresh Directorate or any other empire chooses to test us again with greater commitment, we must be prepared to show considerably more than 40 ships, and considerably less restraint than we extended today. That assessment proved to be remarkably accurate, though it would take 2 more years before the truth of Chen's prediction fully revealed itself. In the meantime, Earth's Defense Council used the encounter as an opportunity to review and refine every aspect of their preparation, treating the Koresh probe not as a crisis safely resolved, but as a warning that the galaxy's patience with the mystery of the human line was beginning to run out. New shipyards were authorized in the months following the encounter, expanding humanity's hidden fleet even further beyond what the galaxy already suspected. Training exercises grew more intensive, simulating not just small probing forces but full-scale invasions, testing whether the fleet's command structure could coordinate a response to threats many times larger than the one Solon's small formation had presented. Sensor networks were upgraded, extending their range even further into the dark spaces surrounding the solar system, ensuring that no future incursion, however cautious or well hidden, would go undetected for more than a few precious seconds. Chen himself was promoted in the aftermath of the encounter, given greater authority over the coordination of Earth's entire defense network, rather than simply commanding a single fleet element. It was a responsibility he accepted with the same quiet, steady seriousness that had defined his entire career, understanding that the encounter with Solon's ships, however small it had seemed in the moment, marked a turning point in humanity's relationship with the wider galaxy. The era of quiet anonymity, in which Earth could simply exist behind its boundary without drawing serious attention from the galaxy's great powers, was coming to an end. What came next would require every ounce of the preparation his predecessors had spent 6 decades building. He spent long hours during those 2 years reviewing intelligence reports about the Koresh Directorate, trying to understand not just their military capabilities but their culture, their history, and the ambitions that had driven General Drenar to authorize the probing mission in the first place. He came to understand, slowly, that the Directorate was a young and hungry empire, built through rapid conquest rather than patient development, an empire that measured its own strength primarily by comparing itself against the weaknesses of others. That understanding shaped much of Chen's planning in the 2 years that followed. He suspected, correctly as it turned out, that a probing force disabled but not destroyed would not be enough to discourage an empire built on the philosophy that weakness invited conquest. Drenar, he predicted in a private assessment shared only with his closest advisors, would likely interpret Earth's restraint as confirmation that humanity lacked the will to fight a genuine war, rather than understanding it as evidence of exactly the opposite. An empire that conquers through opportunism often mistakes mercy for weakness, Chen wrote in that assessment. We must prepare for the strong possibility that today's restraint becomes tomorrow's invitation to greater aggression. If that proves true, our next response cannot afford the same gentleness we extended today. It was a grim prediction, but one that history, over the following 2 years, would prove entirely correct. Earth drew a line in space. Every empire feared what happened when they crossed it. News of the failed Koresh probe spread through the galaxy slowly at first, then all at once, the way important secrets always seem to travel. Captain Solon's crippled ship limped home to Directorate space, but word of what happened did not stay contained within military channels for long. Traders talked, sensor techs talked, A junior officer who had been on the bridge of one of the disabled escort ships told the story to a cousin who worked on a merchant vessel, and within 3 months, the tale of the human line had crossed a dozen star systems, growing a little stranger and a little more frightening with each telling. By the time the story reached the Thren Combine, the 6 disabled ships had become 60. By the time it reached the Skarn Dominion, the 40 human ships that appeared out of nowhere had become 400. Every retelling added a little more mystery, a little more fear, until the human line had become something close to legend across half the galaxy, a boundary that swallowed armies whole and spat back only warnings. General Vosk Drenner knew the truth was different from the legend, but the truth troubled him just as much. He called a meeting of his highest advisors 3 weeks after Solon's return, in a war room now filled with tension that had not existed before the mission. "We have 3 choices," Drenner told them, standing before the same star map, the same small red boundary that had started as a curiosity and become an obsession. "We accept what happened, treat the human line as real, and leave them alone, focusing our expansion elsewhere. We gather more information before deciding anything further. Or we commit to a full invasion, using everything we have learned, and settle this question once and for all." Iset Kor, still the most cautious voice in the room, spoke first. "I recommend the first option. We have expanded into a dozen systems this decade alone. There is no need to risk a war with an enemy whose true strength we do not understand, especially when there is so much easier territory available to us elsewhere." A younger general, a sharp and ambitious woman named Threl Nasa, disagreed immediately. "That is exactly the kind of thinking that will keep the Koresh Directorate a middle power forever. Every great empire in this galaxy's history became great by taking risks other empires were too afraid to take. If humans truly control something as valuable as their restraint suggests, walking away now means handing that advantage to whichever empire is brave enough to take it instead." The debate went on for hours, the same arguments circling again and again, until Drenner finally raised a hand for silence. He had made his decision days before this meeting, though he had waited to hear his advisors argue it out loud first, testing his own certainty against their doubts. "We will gather more information," he said. "Not through another probe, through something more patient. We will send scholars, not soldiers. We will study everything we can find about human history, human culture, human technology, before we decide anything else. If there is a weakness in their line, we will find it through understanding, not through another costly mistake." It was, in the end, the wisest decision Drenner ever made, though it would take years before anyone understood just how wise it truly was, because the information his scholars eventually gathered would change the entire Directorate's understanding of the enemy they were dealing with. The scholars Drenner sent were careful, patient people, trained not for battle but for the slow work of understanding an unfamiliar culture. They traveled to neutral trading stations near the edge of human space, disguised as merchants and diplomats, buying old records, old news reports, old histories that Earth itself had never bothered to hide, because humanity had never expected anyone to look closely enough to find them. What they found painted a picture very different from the weak, harmless species the galaxy had assumed Earth to be for the first several decades after first contact. They learned about Earth's own long and bloody history, a history full of terrible wars fought not against aliens but against other humans, wars that had taught the species hard lessons about survival, unity, and the true cost of underestimating an enemy. They learned that humanity had once been divided into hundreds of separate nations, each with its own army, its own grudges, its own history of conflict, and that only in the final years before first contact had those nations finally, painfully, come together as a single unified species. They learned that the process of unification had not been easy. There had been resistance, disagreement, even violence, as old rivalries fought against the idea of setting aside ancient grudges for the sake of survival in a hostile galaxy. But in the end, humanity had chosen unity, and that choice had become the foundation of everything that followed. Most importantly, the scholars learned about human psychology in a way no other species had bothered to study before, because no other species had ever considered humans important enough to study so carefully. They learned that humans, more than almost any other species in the galaxy, held a deep and powerful drive toward protecting their own, a drive shaped by millions of years of evolution on a dangerous world full of predators and disasters. When threatened directly, humans did not panic and scatter the way some species did. They organized, they cooperated, they became, collectively, far more dangerous than their individual strength might suggest. This drive, the scholars concluded in their final report to General Drennar, explained everything about the line. It was not a bluff born from weakness. It was a defensive wall built by a species whose deepest instinct was to protect what belonged to them, reinforced by decades of careful preparation and unified purpose that few other empires in the galaxy could match, divided as they so often were by internal rivalries and competing factions. They are not hiding weakness behind that boundary, the lead scholar told Drennar during the final briefing, standing before the same star map that had haunted the general's thoughts for months. They are hiding strength, deliberately, patiently, because they understand something most young species never learn in time. A threat you cannot fully measure is far more frightening than a threat you can see clearly. By keeping their true strength hidden behind the line, they force every empire in the galaxy to imagine the worst. And imagination, General, is often a far more effective deterrent than any weapon. Drennar absorbed this information slowly, turning it over in his mind for days afterward. It confirmed what he had begun to suspect since Solan's failed mission, but it also gave him something he had not expected, a plan. If the scholars were right, and human strength truly did come from unity and hidden preparation rather than raw technological superiority alone, then perhaps the line was not truly unbreakable. Perhaps, given enough force, enough determination, and enough willingness to accept losses that a species like the Koresh Directorate could absorb far more easily than a smaller, more cautious civilization, the line could still be broken. He began, quietly and carefully, to build a case for a different kind of test. Not a small probing force this time, easily disarmed and sent home with a warning. A real fleet, large enough to survive whatever defenses Earth had prepared, large enough to gather true intelligence on human capabilities, even if it could not achieve outright victory. It took him nearly 2 years to build the political support within the Directorate to authorize such a mission. 2 years of careful arguments in the war councils. 2 years of showing his fellow generals the scholars' reports. 2 years of convincing a cautious empire that the potential reward of understanding, and perhaps eventually conquering, a species with humanity's hidden strength, was worth the risk of a second, larger confrontation. During those same 2 years, on the other side of the line, Admiral Marcus Chen and the rest of Earth's Defense Command watched the political shifts within the Koresh Directorate with quiet, careful attention. Human intelligence networks, built over decades of patient work and carefully placed contacts throughout the galaxy's trade routes, reported every development in Drennar's slow campaign to authorize a second, larger test of the line. "They're not going to leave it alone," Commander Sarah Osei told Chen during a briefing in the command center, 300 million kilometers from the boundary that had defined so much of both their careers. "Drennar's been building support for a real invasion force for almost 2 years now. Not a probe this time, a genuine attempt to break through." Chen studied the intelligence reports carefully, the same calm expression on his face that had carried him through every crisis of his long career. "How large a force are we expecting?" "Our estimates suggest somewhere between 200 and 300 warships, backed by significant logistical support, large enough to survive heavy losses and still achieve their objective, whatever that objective turns out to be." Chen was quiet for a long moment, thinking not just about the coming threat, but about everything that had led to this point. 63 years of careful preparation. 63 years of building a defense force capable of protecting humanity from exactly this kind of escalation. 63 years of hoping, quietly, that such preparation would never truly be needed, that the mere existence of the line, backed by a single small demonstration of strength, would be enough to keep the galaxy's great empires at a respectful distance forever. That hope, it seemed, was finally coming to an end. "We've prepared for this," Chen said finally, more to reassure himself than anyone else in the room. "Every simulation, every drill, every contingency plan we've built over the past 6 decades has been designed around exactly this scenario. A determined empire, willing to accept losses, testing our defenses with genuine intent rather than simple curiosity. "Are we ready?" Ose asked, and there was no fear in her voice, only the same steady professionalism that had defined Earth's entire defense strategy since the very beginning. Chen looked at the star map floating above the command table, at the boundary of the line stretching in every direction around the small yellow star that humanity called home, and at the 100 hidden shipyards scattered across the outer planets and asteroid belts, each one filled with ships that the rest of the galaxy had never truly seen in action. "We've been ready for 63 years, he said. Now we find out if 63 years was enough. In the 2 years leading up to that moment, while General Drenner built his political case within the Koresh War Councils, life on Earth and its many colonies continued much as it always had, largely untouched by the quiet tension building at the edges of the solar system. This, too, was part of the design behind the line, a deliberate choice made decades before by the earliest architects of Earth's defense strategy. Ordinary citizens were never meant to live in constant fear of invasion. The defense of humanity's home was meant to be carried by dedicated professionals, supported by careful funding and quiet public trust, so that the vast majority of people could simply live their lives, raise their families, and build their futures without the shadow of war hanging over every decision they made. It was a philosophy Admiral Chen believed in deeply, one he had inherited from decades of predecessors who shaped Earth's military doctrine in the years following Ambassador Voss's original declaration. A frightened population made poor decisions, panicked easily, and often turned against its own leadership at the first sign of hardship. A confident population, one that trusted its defenders without needing to understand every detail of their preparations, could weather even the most difficult crisis with unity intact. That trust had been built carefully, generation by generation, through consistent honesty from Earth's government about the general shape of its defense strategy, even while the specific details remained closely guarded secrets. Citizens knew ships were being built. They knew taxes funded shipyards hidden throughout the outer solar system. They knew, in broad terms, that humanity's safety depended on that quiet, patient work continuing without interruption. What they did not know, and did not need to know, were the exact numbers, the exact locations, or the exact capabilities of the fleet that protected them, because that secrecy was itself one of the line's most important defenses. Commander Ose often thought about this balance during the long months of waiting that followed the intelligence reports about Drenar's growing invasion force. She had grown up on a colony station near Titan, the daughter of 2 engineers who had spent their careers building the very sensor networks that now watched the line for any sign of danger. She remembered as a child asking her mother why they lived so far from Earth itself, in a small station orbiting a moon of Saturn that seemed impossibly distant from the heart of human civilization. "Because someone has to watch the edges," her mother had told her, guiding her through the maintenance corridors of the station where dozens of sensor arrays hummed quietly in the dark. "Someone has to make sure nothing surprises us. That's not a job for people who want excitement or glory. It's a job for people who understand that the most important work often goes completely unnoticed, for years, sometimes for entire lifetimes, until the one day it finally matters." That lesson had shaped Ose's entire career, guiding her choice to join the fleet, rather than pursue the comfortable civilian life many of her childhood friends had chosen instead. She understood, the way Chen understood, the way 3 generations of humans behind the line had come to understand, that their quiet years of preparation were not wasted time, even when nothing happened, even when the galaxy paid them no attention at all. Every drill, every simulation, every hour spent refining sensor networks and weapon systems was itself a form of victory, a slow and patient accumulation of strength that would only be tested and only be proven when the moment finally arrived. Now, with Drenner's fleet finally gathering at the edges of human space, that moment had come. Across the solar system, in shipyards scattered from the asteroid belt to the moons of distant Neptune, engineers and pilots and support crews began final preparations, checking systems one last time, running through drills they had practiced hundreds of times before, but which now carried a weight of genuine consequence none of their earlier training had ever truly required. There was no panic among the crews, no sudden fear spreading through the ranks. There was, instead, a quiet, steady determination, the kind that comes from decades of preparation finally meeting its purpose. Pilots checked their ships. Engineers ran final diagnostics. Officers reviewed tactical plans one final time, adjusting small details based on the latest intelligence about the size and composition of the approaching Koresh fleet. Across the growing distance between two very different civilizations, the pieces were falling into place for a confrontation that would decide far more than the fate of a single border dispute. For General Vosk Drenner, it was a chance to finally understand, once and for all, whether the Koresh Directorate's ambitions could survive contact with humanity's hidden strength. For Admiral Marcus Chen and everyone behind the line he had sworn to protect, it was the moment 63 years of patient preparation had been building toward. The moment when quiet strength would finally be forced to reveal itself to a galaxy that had spent decades underestimating a species it never truly understood. Neither side knew exactly what would happen when the two forces finally met. But both sides understood, with growing certainty, that whatever happened next would echo across the galaxy for generations to come, reshaping the balance of power between species who had ruled the stars for centuries and a species who had arrived late, said little, and quietly built something the rest of the galaxy was only now beginning to fear. In the final weeks before the Koresh fleet crossed the line, Admiral Chen made an unusual decision, one that surprised several members of his own command staff. He requested a private meeting with Earth's civilian leadership, the unified council that had governed the planet and its colonies since the completion of the Great Unification decades before, to discuss openly, for the first time, the true scale of what was coming. He stood before the council in a quiet chamber in the capital city, a room far removed from the war rooms and command centers where most of his career had been spent, and he explained, calmly and honestly, exactly what intelligence suggested about the size and intent of the approaching Koresh fleet. "We believe this will be a genuine test of everything we have built," he told the assembled council members, many of whom had grown up hearing about the line only as a distant, almost abstract piece of history, rather than a living, active defense. "Our projections suggest we can defend successfully, with losses we can absorb but that will still be felt deeply across our communities. I will not pretend this will be easy, or that every family in our solar system will emerge from this encounter unchanged." One council member, an older woman named Councillor Priya Nair, who had served in civilian government for over 20 years, asked the question that weighed most heavily on everyone in the room. "Is there any path that avoids this confrontation entirely, Admiral? Any diplomatic option we have not yet explored?" Chen considered the question carefully before answering, unwilling to offer false comfort even in a moment when comfort might have been welcomed. "We have tried, Counselor. Our diplomats have communicated clearly and repeatedly with Koresh representatives over the past 2 years, reaffirming our position, offering continued peaceful trade, making clear that we seek no conflict with their empire. General Drenner has chosen, despite those efforts, to test our resolve directly. I do not believe further diplomacy will change that course now. The fleet is already moving into position. Our choice now is not whether to face this test, but how completely we prepare to meet it." The council ultimately voted, unanimously, to support whatever defensive measures Chen and his command staff deemed necessary, a vote that reflected the same trust between Earth's civilian leadership and its military command that had defined the relationship since the earliest days of the line. It was a trust built carefully over generations, through consistent honesty, careful restraint, and a shared understanding that the defense of humanity's home was a responsibility belonging to every citizen, not simply to the officers and pilots who served on the front lines. News of the Council's decision, though the specific military details remained classified, spread quietly through Earth's colonies and settlements in the days that followed. There was no panic, no rush to prepare bunkers or stockpile supplies, because the vast majority of citizens understood, through decades of quiet reassurance from their government, that the defense they had spent their entire lives quietly funding was finally about to be tested, and that their leaders believed, with good reason, that the preparation would prove sufficient. Still, in quiet moments across the solar system, families found themselves thinking more carefully than usual about the ships and stations scattered throughout the outer planets, about sons and daughters who served in the fleet, about the strange, uncomfortable reality that the peace they had known their entire lives had never truly been guaranteed, only carefully, patiently defended by people most of them would never meet. Admiral Chen returned to his command center in the days following the council meeting, carrying with him not just the tactical burden of the coming battle, but the deeper weight of civilian trust, a trust built across generations and resting now, in this critical moment, on the readiness of a fleet that had waited its entire existence for exactly this test. In one of the hidden shipyards near the moon of Europa, a young engineer named Tomás Reyes, cousin to the pilot who would later fly through the heart of the coming battle, spent the final days before the invasion running one last set of diagnostics on a new class of warship that had only recently entered full production. He had worked on the project for nearly 6 years, since graduating from a technical academy on Earth, and volunteering for assignment to the outer shipyards, drawn by stories his own grandparents told about the importance of the quiet work that few people ever saw or thanked. He was not a soldier, would never fly into battle himself, but he understood, standing in the vast construction bay surrounded by the skeletal frame of a ship that would soon join Chen's growing fleet, that his work mattered just as much as anything the pilots and officers would do in the coming days. Every wire he checked, every system he calibrated, every small imperfection he caught and corrected before the ship ever left the shipyard, was itself a small piece of the defense that would soon be tested against General Drenner's approaching fleet. "You nervous?" asked his supervisor, an older woman named Chief Engineer Diane Okafor, who had spent over 30 years working in the outer shipyards and had seen generations of young engineers pass through her teams. Tomás considered the question honestly before answering. "A little. Mostly I just hope it's enough. All of this, 6 decades of work, and we still don't really know if it's enough until it's actually tested." Okafor smiled, the tired, knowing smile of someone who had spent her entire career believing in work, whose success could never be fully proven until the day it finally mattered. "That's the nature of what we do, Tomás. You build the best thing you know how to build, you test it as thoroughly as you can, and then you trust the people who will use it to do their part when the moment finally comes. That's all any of us can do. That's all Ambassador Voss could do 63 years ago, standing in front of that assembly, promising something none of us had proven yet. Sometimes faith and preparation have to walk together, because neither one alone is quite enough." Her words stayed with Tomás through the final hours before the battle began, a quiet reminder that the coming confrontation, however it unfolded, rested not just on the courage of the pilots who would fly into the fight, but on the accumulated work of thousands of ordinary people scattered across the solar system, each contributing their own small, patient piece to a defense that had taken generations to build and would be tested, finally and completely, in the span of a single afternoon. Earth drew a line in space. Every empire feared what happened when they crossed it. The Koresh Directorate invasion fleet gathered at the edge of human space over the course of 3 weeks, ship by ship, moving quietly through the dark to avoid drawing attention before the final assembly was complete. General Vosk Drenner commanded the fleet personally, 280 warships strong, backed by supply vessels, repair ships, and enough munitions to sustain a prolonged campaign if the initial assault did not achieve a quick victory. Drenner stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Directorate's Pride, watching the assembled fleet on the tactical display, a vast formation of warships stretching across the darkness like a small constellation of steel and fire. It was the largest single fleet the Koresh Directorate had assembled in over a century, built specifically for this one purpose, this one test of an enemy that had haunted the Empire's strategic planning for the past 2 years. "All ships report ready, General," his communications officer announced. "Awaiting your order." Drenner looked at the star map one final time, at the small red boundary that marked the edge of human space, and thought about everything his scholars had learned over the past 2 years, about a species united by shared purpose in a way few galactic empires ever managed, about a defensive strategy built on hidden strength and careful restraint, about Captain Solon's shaken report from 2 years before, and the calm, unhurried voice that had delivered Earth's warning without a trace of fear. He thought, too, about General Isat Kor, who had argued against this mission from the very beginning, and who had quietly requested reassignment to a peaceful border post rather than participate in what he called, in his final conversation with Drenner, a mistake dressed up as ambition. Drenner had dismissed those concerns then, and he dismissed them again now, standing on the bridge of his flagship with 280 warships waiting for his command. "Advance the fleet," he ordered. "Cross the line." The invasion began at dawn by Earth's clocks, though there was no true dawn in the dark between the stars. Only the careful arrangement of time zones humans had brought with them from their homeworld, applied to a solar system that had never known a sunrise before humanity's ships first crossed into its endless night. Admiral Marcus Chen received the warning within seconds of the Koresh fleet crossing the boundary, exactly as he had 2 years before, though this time the sensor reports carried a very different weight. 280 warships, not 6. A genuine invasion force, not a cautious probe. Every simulation, every drill, every contingency plan humanity had built over 6 decades of quiet preparation was about to be tested for real. "They're committed," Commander Sarah Ose reported, standing beside Chen in the command center, as the tactical display filled with the full scale of the approaching Koresh fleet. "This isn't a probe, Admiral, this is everything." Chen nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him, the weight of 63 years of preparation finally coming due. "Then we give them everything they came to find." He gave the order, and across the solar system, in 100 hidden shipyards scattered through the asteroid belt and the moons of the outer planets, Earth's true defense fleet began to move. Not 40 ships this time, gathered for a careful demonstration of restraint. The full strength of humanity's defense force, built patiently over 6 decades, hidden from a galaxy that had never once bothered to look closely enough to see it coming. 600 warships emerged from their hiding places, moving with a coordinated precision that came from decades of drills and simulations, decades of preparing for exactly this moment. They did not rush toward the Koresh fleet in a chaotic charge. They moved with patience, with purpose, converging on the approaching invasion force from multiple directions at once, closing every avenue of retreat before General Drenner's fleet fully understood what it was facing. On the bridge of the Directorate's Pride, Drenner watched the tactical display fill with human contacts, far more than his scholars' estimates had predicted, far more than even his most cautious advisors had warned him to expect. 600 ships, appearing with a suddenness that suggested a defense network far more sophisticated than anything the Koresh Directorate possessed, converging on his fleet from every direction with the calm certainty of a trap that had been prepared for years. That's not possible," his tactical officer said, staring at the display in disbelief. 600 warships. "General, our intelligence estimates were wrong, badly wrong." Drenner felt something cold settle in his chest, the same feeling he had dismissed 2 years before when Captain Solon described the 40 ships that had appeared out of nowhere to disarm his probing force. This time there was no dismissing it. This time the evidence was overwhelming, filling every corner of his tactical display, and there was no retreat fast enough to escape a fleet that had already surrounded his own from every direction. The same calm voice from 2 years before opened a channel to his flagship, and Drenner recognized it immediately, unchanged by the 2 years that had passed, carrying the same steady confidence it had carried during Solon's failed mission. "General Vosk Drenner," the voice said, "this is Admiral Marcus Chen of Earth's Defense Fleet. You have brought 280 warships across our line. We gave you a warning 2 years ago, delivered by your Captain Solon, and you chose not to heed it. We understand why. A species that has spent generations conquering weaker neighbors learns to doubt warnings from those it perceives as weak. We hope, after today, that lesson will no longer need repeating." Drenner's hands tightened at his sides, pride and fear warring within him in equal measure. "Admiral Chen," he said, his voice carrying across the open channel to every ship in both fleets. "The Koresh Directorate did not come here seeking conquest alone. We came seeking understanding, seeking answers about a species that has hidden its strength behind empty warnings for over 60 years. If you wish to demonstrate that strength today, we are prepared to accept the cost of learning it firsthand." There was a brief pause on the channel, and when Chen's voice returned, it carried something that surprised Drenner, a note of genuine regret rather than triumph or anger. "Then let us begin, General. But know that we take no pleasure in what comes next. Every ship you lose today was built by people who wanted nothing more than to live their lives free of fear. Every ship we send against you today was built for the same reason. We did not choose this conflict, you did. when you crossed our line a second time despite the warning we gave freely, and paid for, in Captain Solan's mission 2 years ago. The channel closed, and for a long, terrible moment, both fleets held their positions in the vast darkness of space. 600 human warships, surrounding 280 Koresh vessels, in a formation that left no room for escape, no room for retreat, no room for anything, but the battle both commanders now understood was inevitable. The battle began with a suddenness that left even Drenner's most experienced officers struggling to process what was happening. Human weapons technology, hidden for 63 years behind careful secrecy and a galaxy's collective indifference, proved to be generations ahead of anything the Koresh Directorate had ever encountered. Precision strikes disabled engines and weapon systems across the Directorate fleet, with a speed and accuracy that seemed almost impossible, ship after ship going dark within the first 20 minutes of engagement. But this time, unlike the careful restraint shown during Solan's failed probe 2 years before, the human fleet did not limit itself entirely to disabling strikes. When Koresh ships fought back, when weapons were fired and human vessels came under genuine attack, Admiral Chen's fleet responded with the full measure of force the situation required, destroying ships that continued to resist, even after their formation had been broken and their retreat cut off. Drenner watched his fleet crumble around him with a growing sense of horror, understanding too late the true scale of the mistake he had made. His scholars had been right about human unity, right about human preparation, right about the hidden strength that lay behind 63 years of careful restraint. But they had underestimated, as had Drenner himself, just how far ahead of the rest of the galaxy that preparation had brought humanity's technology and tactics. "General, we're losing ships faster than we can coordinate a response," his tactical officer reported, desperation creeping into his voice, as the display filled with more and more Koresh vessels going dark, destroyed, or drifting powerless in the vacuum. "If we don't retreat now, we won't have a fleet left to retreat with." Drenner stared at the display, at the wreckage of 2 years of careful planning and political maneuvering, at the proof of everything Iset Kor had warned him about, before requesting reassignment, rather than watch this outcome unfold. Pride warred with survival instinct for one final, agonizing moment, before the weight of his responsibility to the crews still fighting and dying under his command finally broke through. "All ships, general retreat," Drenner ordered, his voice heavy with the bitter taste of defeat. "Withdraw across the boundary immediately. Do not engage unless directly fired upon." The order came almost too late. By the time the surviving Koresh ships began their retreat, less than half of Drenner's original fleet remained combat-capable. The rest either destroyed outright or left drifting and disabled in the dark, their crews alive, but their ships no longer fit for battle. Admiral Chen's fleet did not pursue beyond the boundary of the line, exactly as 63 years of careful doctrine had always intended. The moment the surviving Koresh ships crossed back into neutral space, the human fleet held its position, watching, but not following. The same calm voice opened one final channel to Drenner's battered flagship as the retreat continued. "General Drenner, your fleet is free to withdraw. We will not pursue beyond our boundary. This has always been the nature of our line, General. We defend what is ours. We do not seek to conquer what is not. I hope, after today, the galaxy finally understands the difference, and understands why testing that boundary carries a cost few empires can afford to pay twice." Drenner sat in silence on the bridge of his crippled flagship, watching the wreckage of his ambition drift behind him as the remaining ships of his fleet limped back across the line toward Directorate space. He had come seeking to understand humanity's hidden strength, and he had found his answer, though it was not the answer he had hoped for when this campaign began 2 years before. Behind him, scattered across the dark expanse of the battle site, more than 150 Koresh warships drifted silent and broken, a testament to a lesson the galaxy would spend the coming years struggling to fully absorb. Earth's line had never been a bluff. It had never been empty theater performed by a weak and frightened species. It had been, from the very beginning, exactly what Ambassador Elena Voss had promised in the Grand Assembly of the Concord over 60 years before. A boundary humanity would defend with whatever force the situation required, backed by decades of patient, hidden preparation that no other empire in the galaxy had thought to take seriously, until it was far too late to matter. As his flagship crossed back into neutral space, General Vosk Drenar looked one final time at the tactical display, at the small red boundary that had cost him half his fleet and very nearly his own life, and understood, with a clarity that would haunt him for the rest of his career, that the galaxy's long era of underestimating humanity had finally, decisively, come to an end. During the height of the battle, aboard one of the 600 human warships that had answered Chen's call, a young pilot named Lieutenant Amara Reyes flew her fighter through the chaos of the engagement, her hands steady on the controls despite the danger surrounding her on every side. She had trained for this exact scenario more times than she could count, running the same simulations again and again since her earliest days at the Academy on Mars. But nothing had quite prepared her for the strange, quiet clarity that settled over her the moment real combat finally began. Her orders were simple and precise, the same orders given to every pilot in Chen's fleet. Target weapon systems and engines wherever possible. Avoid unnecessary destruction of enemy vessels. Respond with lethal force only when a ship continued to fire despite being given the opportunity to withdraw. It was a difficult balance to maintain in the heat of battle, requiring discipline that went beyond simple survival instinct. But it was a balance every pilot in the fleet had drilled into their reflexes through years of careful training. She watched, through her cockpit display, as a Koresh escort ship broke formation and turned to flee rather than continue fighting, and she felt something close to relief as she redirected her fire toward a different target, still actively engaging her formation. Every ship that chose retreat over resistance was a ship that would not need to be destroyed, a crew that would return home intact rather than becoming another statistic in the long, sad history of galactic warfare. Not every human pilot found that restraint easy to maintain. Reyes lost a close friend during the battle, a fellow pilot named Jorge Delacroix, whose fighter took a direct hit from a Koresh ship that had refused to disengage, even after its weapon systems were nearly destroyed. She learned of his death only after the battle ended, when the casualty reports began circulating through the fleet, and she sat alone in her quarters that night, staring at nothing, feeling the true cost of the victory settle over her, in a way the heat of battle had not allowed. This, too, was part of the story that would rarely be told in the years that followed, as the legend of the human line grew across the galaxy. The battle had not been bloodless for humanity, even in victory. 43 human pilots and crew members lost their lives defending the boundary their ancestors had drawn 63 years before, a cost that Admiral Chen carried with him long after the tactical reports were filed and the celebrations, such as they were, had quietly ended. Elsewhere in the battle, aboard a badly damaged Koresh escort ship that had lost most of its weapon systems within the first 10 minutes of engagement, a young Directorate engineer named Tavan Osk worked frantically alongside his crewmates to keep life support functioning as their ship drifted, powerless, in the middle of the chaos surrounding them. He had joined the Koresh military only 2 years before, drawn by stories of glory and conquest that had defined much of his childhood, and he found himself now huddled in a darkened engineering bay, praying quietly to whatever gods his people still believed in, hoping simply to survive long enough to see his family again. When the human boarding party finally arrived, hours after the main battle had ended, Osk expected violence, expected the kind of brutal treatment his own empire's military doctrine assumed would be standard practice for any conquering force securing a defeated enemy vessel. Instead, he found calm, professional soldiers who checked the ship for injured crew, provided basic medical care to those who needed it, and explained clearly, in careful and precise Koresh translation, that his ship and crew would be released to return home once repairs sufficient for the journey had been completed. Why? Osk finally asked one of the human soldiers, a quiet woman who had spent nearly an hour helping stabilize a wounded crewmate in the ship's medical bay. Why help us? We came here to attack your home. The soldier considered the question for a moment before answering, her expression neither cold nor overly warm, simply honest. Because the war is over, the moment you stop fighting, what happens after that is a choice, not an obligation. We chose not to make this worse than it needed to be. That single exchange, small and unremarkable in the grand scale of the battle, would eventually become one of the most repeated stories among Directorate crews who had survived the encounter, a strange counterpoint to the fear and legend growing around Earth's military strength. The humans who had broken General Drenner's fleet in less than an hour had also, in the aftermath, shown a kind of careful decency that few empires in the galaxy extended even to their own defeated soldiers, let alone an enemy that had come seeking conquest. It was a detail that would matter more than anyone involved in the battle realized at the time, shaping how the wider galaxy eventually came to understand not just human strength, but human character, and the strange, unfamiliar combination of overwhelming power, paired with genuine restraint, that would come to define humanity's reputation among the stars for generations to come. Back on the Directorate's Pride, in the hours immediately following the order to retreat, General Drenner retreated to his private quarters and sat alone for a long while, staring at nothing, trying to process the scale of what had just happened. He had entered this campaign believing himself a careful, measured commander, someone who understood risk and weighed it properly against potential reward. Watching more than 150 of his warships reduced to drifting wreckage within a single hour had shattered that self-image completely, leaving him uncertain not just about his judgment in this specific campaign, but about decisions he had made throughout his entire career. His aide, a young officer named Yuri Kessel who had served under Drenner for nearly 5 years, found him there sometime later, still sitting quietly in the dim light of his private quarters. Kessel had been on the bridge throughout the battle, had watched the tactical display fill with destroyed and disabled ships, and had seen, more clearly than most, the exact moment his general's confidence had finally broken. "Sir," Kessel said quietly, standing in the doorway, uncertain whether to intrude on his commander's silence. "The fleet has stabilized. We're clear of the immediate battle zone. Repair crews are already working on the ships that can be salvaged." Drenner nodded slowly, not turning to look at his aide. "How many, Kessel? Give me the real number, not the optimistic estimate the tactical officers keep offering." Kessel hesitated before answering. 163 ships destroyed, or too damaged to repair, sir. Another 40 currently disabled but salvageable, given time and proper facilities. Of our original 280, we return with roughly 77 combat-capable vessels. The number hung in the air between them, heavier than either man wanted to acknowledge directly. Drenner had entered human space with one of the largest fleets the Koresh Directorate had assembled in over a century. He was returning with barely a quarter of that force still fully operational, the rest destroyed, disabled, or lost entirely in a battle that had lasted less than 60 minutes from the first exchange of fire to his own order to withdraw. "They could have destroyed us completely," Drenner finally said, more to himself than to Kessel. "Every ship, every crew member, gone without a trace, and the galaxy would have had nothing but rumors to explain what happened to us. Instead, they let us retreat, with enough of a fleet intact to carry their message home ourselves. Do you think that was mercy, sir, or strategy?" Drenner considered the question for a long moment before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that Kessel had never heard from his commander before. "Perhaps both, Kessel. Perhaps for a species like humans, mercy and strategy are simply the same thing, viewed from different angles. A destroyed fleet tells the galaxy nothing except that we disappeared. A defeated fleet, returning home battered but alive, tells every empire watching exactly what happened, exactly why it happened, and exactly what will happen again to anyone foolish enough to repeat our mistake. That is a far more effective message than silence ever could have been." The two men sat together in quiet reflection for a while longer, the weight of the battle settling slowly into the kind of understanding that only comes after genuine, humbling defeat. Outside, throughout the remainder of the crippled fleet, similar conversations were happening across 100 different ships, crews trying to process not just the losses they had suffered, but the deeper, more unsettling realization that the enemy they had been sent to test had never truly been tested at all. They had glimpsed only a fraction of humanity's true strength, enough to break their fleet decisively, while Admiral Chen's forces had held back from revealing the full extent of what remained hidden behind the line, patient and prepared, waiting for a threat that might never prove large enough to require its complete revelation. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, as the human fleet began the slow work of recovering disabled Koresh vessels and escorting them toward the boundary for release, Admiral Chen convened a brief meeting with his senior staff aboard his flagship. The mood was subdued rather than celebratory, a reflection of the losses his own fleet had suffered even in decisive victory, and a recognition that the day's events marked not an ending, but the beginning of a new chapter in humanity's relationship with the wider galaxy. "We showed them roughly a third of our full strength today," Commander O.C. reported, reviewing the final tallies from the engagement. 600 ships, when our total fleet strength now exceeds 1,700 vessels across all classes. If Drenar or any other empire decides to test us again with a larger force, we still have considerable reserves we chose not to reveal. Chen nodded slowly, studying the tactical display one final time before the debriefing concluded. "Good. Let's hope they never need to see the rest. But make sure the intelligence networks confirm exactly what story reaches the wider galaxy. I want the Koresh Directorate's defeat understood clearly, but I do not want exaggeration to replace the truth. The truth is frightening enough on its own, and exaggeration only invites overconfident commanders to underestimate us differently the next time, assuming rumors have inflated what we're actually capable of." It was a subtle point, but one that reflected the same careful philosophy that had guided every decision behind the line since its very first day. Humanity's strength was real, proven now beyond any reasonable doubt, but the manner in which that strength became known to the galaxy mattered almost as much as the strength itself. A legend built on exaggeration could eventually be tested and found wanting. A reputation built on documented, verifiable fact would endure far longer, understood clearly by every empire that took the time to study exactly what had happened at the boundary of human space on that single, decisive afternoon. As the last of the disabled Koresh ships crossed back over the line under their own reduced power, escorted respectfully rather than pursued with hostility, Admiral Chen allowed himself a rare moment of quiet reflection, watching the boundary that had defined his entire career finally prove itself, at great cost, but proven all the same. 63 years of patient work, 63 years of preparation that most of the galaxy had dismissed as bluff or theater, had finally met its test and had not been found wanting. Earth drew a line in space. Every empire feared what happened when they crossed it. News of the battle at the human line spread across the galaxy faster than any story before it. This time there was no need to exaggerate the numbers or add mysterious details to make the tale more frightening. The truth alone was enough. A fleet of 280 warships, sent by one of the galaxy's rising powers, had been broken in less than an hour by a defense force that appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly once the battle was over. More than half the Koresh Directorate's invasion fleet had been destroyed or disabled. The rest limped home carrying a message that needed no exaggeration to terrify every empire that heard it. Earth's line was real. In the Grand Assembly of the Concord, the same chamber where Ambassador Elena Voss had first announced humanity's boundary 63 years before, a very different mood filled the room when the topic of Earth arose again. The Thren Combine delegate who had once laughed at the idea of a border drawn by a weak species sat in careful, respectful silence when a new human ambassador rose to speak. The Skarn Dominion, the Vantic Assembly, and dozens of smaller empires that had once treated Earth's diplomats as an afterthought now listened with genuine attention to every word spoken on humanity's behalf. The new ambassador, a calm and measured man named David Okonkwo, did not gloat over the Directorate's defeat. He did not celebrate or boast about human strength. He simply stood before the assembly, much as Voss had done decades before, and delivered a message that carried the same quiet confidence that had defined every human statement about the line since the very beginning. 63 years ago, my predecessor told this assembly that we hoped no one would ever need to learn what happens when the line is crossed, Okonkwo said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. We meant those words then, and we mean them now. We take no joy in what happened at our border. We take no pride in the losses suffered by the Koresh Directorate, losses that could have been entirely avoided had our warning been believed the first time it was tested. We ask once again for the same simple respect we have always asked for. Leave our boundary undisturbed, and we will remain, as we have always been, a peaceful neighbor to every empire in this galaxy. The assembly listened in complete silence, and when Okonkwo finished speaking and returned to his seat, no one laughed. No one dismissed his words as empty theater. The galaxy had learned at great cost to the Koresh Directorate that humanity's restraint was a choice, not a limitation, and that the same species capable of such careful patience was equally capable of decisive, overwhelming force when that patience was finally exhausted. General Vosk Drenner did not attend the assembly session. He remained in Directorate space, overseeing the slow, painful process of rebuilding a fleet that had lost more than half its strength in a single afternoon, and facing the consequences of a decision that had cost the Koresh Directorate both ships and reputation in equal measure. He was not removed from command, though the political damage from the failed invasion followed him for the rest of his career, a permanent reminder of the day he had chosen ambition over the careful warnings of officers wiser than himself. In a quiet moment, months after the battle, Drenner met privately with Iset Kor, the old general who had argued against the mission from its earliest planning stages. Kor had returned from his peaceful border post upon hearing news of the battle, not to gloat over being proven right, but simply to see how his old friend and commander was managing the aftermath. "You were right," Drenner admitted, sitting across from Kor in a quiet office, far from the war rooms and political chambers where the decision to invade had first been made. "About all of it, their unity, their preparation, their restraint. I saw it all laid out before me in the scholars' reports, and I still convinced myself that ambition could overcome caution." Kor was quiet for a long moment before responding, choosing his words carefully. "The mistake was not in wanting to understand them, Vosk. Every empire in this galaxy should have studied Earth as carefully as our scholars finally did. The mistake was believing that understanding a threat meant you had also found a way to defeat it. Sometimes the wisest response to genuine strength is simply respect, not conquest." Drenner nodded slowly, staring out at the stars visible through his office window, thinking about the small red boundary that had cost his empire so dearly, and about the calm, steady voice of Admiral Marcus Chen, who had shown mercy even in victory, disabling ships rather than destroying them wherever the battle allowed, sparing lives even as he broke the Koresh Directorate's ambitions beyond the boundary of Earth space. "Do you think they will ever be tested again?" Drenner asked quietly. "Now that the galaxy has seen what happens at their line." Kor considered the question carefully before answering. "Perhaps, eventually, by some empire foolish enough to believe their own strength exceeds humanity's preparation. But I suspect it will be a very long time before anyone tries again, Vosk. You paid the price of that lesson for the rest of the galaxy, whether you intended to or not. Every empire that heard about the battle at Earth's line now understands something they did not understand before. Humanity did not become strong by accident. They became strong through decades of patient, careful preparation, hidden from a galaxy too arrogant to look closely at a species it dismissed as weak and unimportant. That is a lesson no empire will forget quickly." Back on Earth, in the quiet command center buried deep within the asteroid 300 million kilometers from the boundary he had spent his entire career defending, Admiral Marcus Chen sat alone after the celebrations following the battle had finally quieted down. He thought about the crews he had lost in the fighting. Fewer than the Koresh Directorate, but not none. Families across the solar system who would spend the coming weeks grieving sons and daughters who had given their lives defending a boundary that had, for 63 years, existed mostly as a promise rather than a proven fact. He thought, too, about the crews of the Koresh Directorate ships he had disabled but spared. More than 100 vessels left drifting rather than destroyed, their crews given the chance to return home rather than die for a mistake made by commanders far above their rank. It had been a difficult decision in the heat of battle, balancing the need to send an unmistakable message against the deeper human instinct to avoid unnecessary cruelty, even toward an enemy that had come seeking conquest. Commander Sarah Osei found him there, still sitting quietly before the tactical display, the battle's data still scrolling slowly across the screen even hours after the fighting had ended. "You did the right thing, Marcus," she said, using his first name in the quiet privacy of the empty command center, something she rarely did during official duty hours. "Restraint even in victory. That's what makes us different from empires like the Koresh Directorate. That's what the whole galaxy is going to remember about today. Not just that we won, but how we won." Chen nodded slowly, though the weight of the day's losses still sat heavy on his shoulders. 63 years of preparation, and it still cost us people we can never replace. I keep wondering if there was another way, some path that could have avoided this entirely. Osei sat down beside him, considering her answer carefully. Maybe there wasn't. Not really. Some lessons only stick when they cost something real. The Koresh Directorate needed to learn that our line was more than words, and the only way to teach that lesson completely was to prove it. Once, decisively, so that no other empire feels the need to test it again for a very long time. That's not a happy truth, but I think it's the true one. Chen looked out at the star map still displayed above the command table, at the small red boundary that had defined his entire career, at the 600 ships that had proven, finally and completely, that humanity's 63 years of patient preparation had been worth every difficult sacrifice it demanded along the way. "We built this line to protect our home," he said quietly, more to himself than to Osei. "Not to conquer anyone else's, not to prove we were stronger than every empire in this galaxy, just to be left alone, to grow, to build our own future, without living in constant fear of everything beyond our own sky." "And now the whole galaxy knows that," Osei said. "They know we mean it. Maybe that's worth the cost in the end. Maybe now we finally get the peace we've been preparing for all along." In the years that followed, the galaxy did change, slowly but unmistakably, in the way it treated humanity, and the boundary they had drawn around their small, quiet corner of space. No empire tested the line again for many decades. Trade with Earth increased, careful and respectful, conducted by merchants and diplomats who understood, finally, that the species behind that boundary deserved to be treated as an equal, rather than dismissed as an afterthought. The Grand Assembly of the Concord began seeking Earth's opinion on major galactic matters, a courtesy humanity had never received during its first 6 decades among the stars. Humanity did not use its newfound respect to build an empire of its own, did not seek to conquer new territories or subjugate weaker species, the way so many empires before them had done throughout the galaxy's long history. They remained, as Ambassador Okonkwo had promised in the Grand Assembly, a peaceful neighbor, quietly building, quietly growing, quietly proving, decade after decade, that strength did not have to come paired with cruelty, and that a species could defend what belonged to it without needing to take what belonged to others. The story of the human line became, over time, one of the most well-known tales in the galaxy, told and retold across 100 different species, a cautionary lesson passed down to young officers and ambitious commanders in every empire that had learned, sometimes the hard way, that appearances could be deeply, dangerously deceiving. A species that seemed weak might simply be patient, a boundary that seemed empty might simply be waiting, and a promise, however quietly made, however many years passed without needing to be proven, might still be entirely, unshakably real. Earth had drawn a line in space, and for 63 long years, the galaxy had wondered whether that line meant anything at all. When the answer finally came, delivered not in threats or boasts but in careful, measured, unmistakable action, every empire that heard the story understood, completely and permanently, exactly why humanity's line had become the one boundary in the entire galaxy that no one dared to cross again. 10 years after the battle, Lieutenant Amara Reyes, now a senior captain commanding her own vessel within the fleet Admiral Chen had once led, stood before a class of new academy graduates on Mars, tasked with the same duty that had once been given to officers before her, passing down the lessons of the line to a new generation who had grown up hearing about the battle only as history, never as lived experience. "Some of you will spend your entire careers behind this boundary, without ever firing a weapon in anger," she told the young cadets, standing in the same lecture hall where she herself had once sat, listening to older officers describe a peace she had not yet understood the true cost of maintaining. "That is not failure. That is success. The purpose of everything we build, everything we train for, everything we sacrifice in quiet hours nobody else will ever see, is to make sure the day never comes when our strength is truly needed again. We hope for boredom. We prepare for war. Never mistake one for weakness, or the other for glory." Her words echoed something her own mentors had told her years before, a philosophy that had guided Earth's defense strategy since long before she was born, refined across generations of officers who understood that the true measure of the line's success was not the battle it had won, but the centuries of peace it hoped, quietly and patiently, to preserve afterward. General Vosk Drenner lived out the remainder of his military career in a directorate now fundamentally changed by the lessons of his failed invasion. He never rose to higher command after the battle, his ambitions permanently checked by the scale of his miscalculation, but he spent his final years serving as an advisor to younger officers, teaching them, much as Iset Kor had once tried to teach him, the difference between genuine strength and the illusion of weakness that came from underestimating a patient, disciplined enemy. He met, on rare occasions throughout the following decade, with human diplomats who traveled through Directorate space on careful, respectful trade missions, and he found himself, despite everything the battle had cost him, developing something close to genuine respect for the species he had once dismissed so completely. In one of his final recorded conversations before retiring from public service, he was asked by a young Directorate historian what lesson he most wanted future generations to take from his failed campaign against Earth. Strength that announces itself is strength that can be measured, and strength that can be measured can eventually be overcome, Drenner said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom rather than the pride that had once defined his younger years. Strength that waits quietly, patiently, disciplined enough to hide behind decades of careful restraint, is the most dangerous strength in this galaxy, because you never truly know its limits until you have already crossed a line you cannot uncross. Earth taught us that lesson at great cost. I hope no other empire needs to learn it the same way we did. The galaxy, in the decades that followed, slowly settled into a new understanding of its balance of power, one that included, for the first time since humanity's arrival among the stars, genuine respect for a species that had once been dismissed as an afterthought at the bottom of the ladder of standing. Earth did not use that respect to build an empire of conquest, remaining true to the promise Ambassador Voss had first made in the Grand Assembly, and the promise Ambassador Okonkwo had renewed after the battle at the line. They remained a peaceful neighbor, quietly growing, quietly building, quietly proving, generation after generation, that a species could hold overwhelming strength without ever needing to use it for anything beyond the simple, quiet right to be left alone. And on the edge of that small, unremarkable solar system, the line remained exactly where it had always been, invisible to the eye, marked only on star charts and old memories, a boundary that had once seemed like empty theater to a galaxy too arrogant to look closely, and had become, through patience, sacrifice, and quiet unbreakable resolve, the one promise in the entire galaxy that every empire, great and small, finally understood was never meant to be tested twice. Commander Sarah Osei eventually succeeded Marcus Chen as head of Earth's Unified Defense Command, a transition that came not through sudden crisis but through the quiet, orderly passing of responsibility that had become tradition among the officers who guarded the line. Chen retired to a small home on the Martian surface, not far from where his grandfather had once told him stories about the quiet courage required to prepare for a war that might never come, and he spent his remaining years writing, teaching, and occasionally advising the younger officers who now carried forward the responsibility he had once held. He was asked, during one of his final public appearances at the academy where he had trained as a young pilot decades before, whether he ever regretted the losses Earth suffered during the battle, whether some part of him wished a different path might have avoided the conflict entirely. He considered the question carefully, the way he had considered nearly every difficult question throughout his long career, before offering an answer that would be quoted often in the years following his death. "I regret every loss," he said, addressing a hall full of young cadets who had grown up in a galaxy that finally treated Earth with genuine respect, a privilege their parents and grandparents had never known. "I regret Jorge Delacroix and the 42 others who did not return from that battle. I regret every family that received the news no family ever wants to receive. But I do not regret the preparation that made our defense possible, and I do not regret the restraint that ensured our victory did not become a massacre. We built something rare in this galaxy, something worth protecting and worth passing forward. Strength paired with conscience, power paired with mercy. If you remember nothing else from my time in this role, remember that the two are not opposites. The strongest among us are often the ones most careful about how that strength gets used." His words became part of the standard curriculum taught to every new generation of officers who trained to serve behind the line, a philosophy passed down alongside the technical skills and tactical knowledge required for the job. The galaxy had learned, through hard experience, that humanity's boundary was real and would be defended without hesitation. But it was this second lesson, quieter and less dramatic than the battle itself, that ultimately defined how the galaxy came to understand humanity as the decades passed. Not simply as a species capable of overwhelming force, but as a species that chose, again and again, to wield that force, with a discipline and conscience that few empires before them had ever managed to maintain. Trade between Earth and the wider galaxy continued to grow in the years that followed, careful and mutually respectful, conducted between equals rather than between a dominant power and a dismissed afterthought. Human engineers, once hired only for cheap labor on foreign shipyards, found themselves increasingly sought after as genuine experts, their knowledge respected rather than merely exploited. Human diplomats found themselves welcomed into discussions that would once have excluded them entirely, their opinions carrying real weight in decisions that shaped the wider galactic community. And far behind the boundary that had made all of it possible, in the quiet corners of a solar system most of the galaxy had once considered unremarkable, life continued much as it always had. Children grew up hearing the old stories, about Ambassador Voss and her promise before the Grand Assembly, about Admiral Chen and the battle that finally proved that promise true, about a species that had arrived late among the stars, and quietly, patiently, built something the rest of the galaxy would never again dare to underestimate. The line remained, the peace it protected remained, and the promise first spoken 63 years before its greatest test finally arrived, remained exactly what it had always been, unbroken, unshaken, and, for every empire wise enough to remember the lesson, never again worth the terrible cost of testing. Many years later, long after Admiral Chen had passed away peacefully in his small home on the Martian surface, a new ambassador stood before the Grand Assembly of the Concord to deliver Earth's regular report on trade and diplomatic relations, a routine formality that had become as ordinary as any other item on the Assembly's long agenda. There was no tension in the chamber when the human delegate rose to speak, no lingering fear or suspicion, only the calm, respectful attention any established and trusted power commanded among its equals. A young delegate from a species that had only recently joined the wider galactic community, still learning the customs and unwritten rules that governed relations between empires old and new, leaned toward an older colleague and asked quietly why the human representative seemed to command such immediate, unquestioned respect from every corner of the chamber, more so than delegates from empires far larger and far older than Earth had ever been. The older delegate, who remembered the stories well, though he had been young himself when the battle at the human line first reshaped the galaxy's understanding of what humanity truly was, considered the question for a moment before offering the simplest answer he could find. Because a long time ago, he said, an empire far stronger than this new species crossed a line humanity drew around their home, believing the boundary was empty words from a weak and frightened people. They learned, in less than an hour, exactly how wrong that belief was. Every empire in this galaxy has heard that story since, and every empire understands, without needing it explained twice, that some promises are worth keeping, simply because the alternative was proven, once and for all, to be far too costly to ever consider again. The young delegate nodded slowly, filing the story away alongside the countless other lessons a new species had to learn quickly, if it hoped to survive and thrive among the galaxy's older, more established powers. It was, in the end, exactly the outcome Ambassador Voss had hoped for on that first quiet day, 63 years before the battle, and the outcome Admiral Chen had spent his entire career working to secure. Not conquest, not glory, simply a boundary respected, a peace preserved, and a promise, once tested, never doubted again.